welcome back to our ongoing series on civilization. Over the past few weeks, we've taken an expansive journey through the foundational aspects of human societies, examining how culture and social structures evolved from early symbolic rituals to more complex societal organizations. Before we dive into tonight's central topic, the relationship between Christianity and the Roman Empire, let's briefly recap what we've covered so far and how it leads into our current discussion. We began by questioning the traditional definition of civilization, often reduced to technological advancements, written records, and monumental architecture, and drawing from the critical perspectives of John Berger and challenging and updating Kenneth Clark's Eurocentric conceptions, we explored civilization as a dynamic interplay of symbolic culture, power, and ecological adaptation. Central to our initial conversation was the insight drawn from Emil Durkheim that shared symbolic frameworks, collective consciousness, serve as essential precursors to more complex social structures. These symbolic universes allow groups to imagine common purposes, navigate tensions, and maintain cohesion despite constant changes in their environment. Building on this theoretical foundation, in the second lecture we turned our attention to the origins of societal complexity through rituals and mobility. We highlighted archaeological case studies such as Göbekli Tepe in present-day Turkey and Cahokia in North America, places that illustrate how large-scale ritual gatherings preceded settled agriculture and urbanization. We questioned the conventional notion that civilizations must be sedentary or agriculturally based, challenging assumptions around what constitutes advanced societal forms. Movement, we argued, drawing heavily upon insights from Lewis Mumford and David Graeber, was not simply a transitional phase in human history. Rather, it offered societies strategic flexibility, adaptability to environmental changes, and a resilience often absent in sedentary cultures. Thus, civilization, we've argued, was never about one single developmental path, but a balance between rootedness and mobility, stability and freedom, hierarchy and egalitarianism. Tonight, as we transition into our third lecture, we examine one of the most historically significant instances of cultural and ideological synthesis, the Roman Empire's interaction with Christianity. The Roman Empire, at its height, represents perhaps the archetype of a settled agricultural civilization, structured, hierarchical, bureaucratic, and economically reliant on extensive slavery. It provided stability, wealth, and cultural integration to vast populations through sophisticated governance, legal innovations, and a robust military. Yet, despite this immense power and stability, it faced inherent contradictions and vulnerabilities, not least of which arose from its huge dependence on forced labor, the tension between diverse populations, and the finite limits of territorial expansion. Christianity emerged in this complex landscape, initially as a fringe religious movement, but soon growing to exert profound cultural, social, and political influence across the empire. Far from being a passive element, Christianity actively reshaped Roman ideological and cultural systems, eventually becoming institutionalized at the empire's core. In doing so, Christianity itself was irrevocably changed, adapting and integrating Roman traditions, philosophical ideas, and organizational structures. The religion that once preached equality and freedom among slaves and oppressed peoples became closely associated with imperial authority and hierarchical governance. However, it's crucial to recognize that the Roman Christian synthesis is but one path among many. To fully understand dynamics at play, tonight we'll also look at alternative spiritual responses to imperial influence, particularly Ethiopian Christianity and Ashanti spirituality. Ethiopia presents a distinct and fascinating parallel, having adopted Christianity more or less independently from Roman and Byzantine influences, maintaining a uniquely autonomous spiritual tradition deeply rooted in local culture and identity. By contrast, the Ashanti Empire in West Africa resisted Christianity's spread through the sustained vitality of indigenous spiritual practices, demonstrating how traditional religion could underpin cultural resilience and rejection of imperial encroachment. As we delve into these core comparative studies, the core question tonight will be, how does religion function as both an ideological tool for empire and a source of resistance against imperial domination? Through examining these interactions between spiritual systems, empire, and cultural synthesis, we hope to gain deeper insight into how civilizations use religion, not only to justify power and hierarchy, but also to challenge, resist, or transform it. With this contextual framing in mind, we will now turn to a detailed examination of the structural characteristics of the Roman Empire itself, its economic foundations, legal systems, military organization, and ultimately how these laid the groundwork for Christianity's profound impact. So to fully understand Christianity's transformative effect on Roman civilization and vice versa, we need a deeper grasp of the Roman Empire's fundamental structure, including its deep roots in the Mediterranean world, as well as the legacy of Greek civilization. So, the historian Ferdinand Brodel famously characterized the Mediterranean as a complex system of interconnected civilizations. And what's interesting about thinking of the Mediterranean as a system is you can see these overlapping layers of prior civilizational influence. So you've got Egypt, the Levant, Asia Minor, Greece, Italian Peninsula, Atlas Mountains, Libya, Spain, France, and then what's most important to understand about the Mediterranean, however, is not its most obvious feature, which is the large sea, but as you can see in this map, it's actually the mountains that are the core structuring influence on where cities and civilizations are centered. So the mountains provide a number of resources, the most important of which is fresh water. So the tributaries that flow from the mountains to the coast provide that fresh water as well as the coastal access for trade and fishing. There's also opportunities to harvest wood, various other mountain-based resources, and including even ice, which was used for refrigeration even in the warm Mediterranean climate. So the Roman Empire can really best be understood as a culmination of this long history of Mediterranean dominance, which began with the Sea Peoples, who defined the earlier regional trade works. These became the Phoenicians, the Minoans, the Greeks, and each of these earlier civilizations carved out crucial pathways across the Mediterranean seas, creating the conditions under which Roman power would later flourish. It was this deeply integrated network of maritime routes that enabled Rome to amass its great wealth, importing essential goods such as Egyptian wheat and cotton, purple dyes from Tyre, spices, other luxury commodities across the whole region. This economic system, underpinned by extensive maritime trade, became fundamental to Rome's ability to manage its vast empire. But Rome didn't emerge in a vacuum. Its foundations lay in these earlier imperial traditions, particularly the Greek. The Greek city-states, characterized as fragmented polities, had established important precedents for Roman civilization. Greek society, famously exemplified by Athens, created a complex and deeply stratified system of citizens, metics, who were resident foreigners, and slaves. This tripartite social structure was later adapted and expanded by Alexander the Great, who facilitated Greek cultural hegemony across vast territories, stretching from the Mediterranean basin to India. The legacy of this earlier Greek system was crucial. It allowed a flexible integration of diverse populations into empire-wide frameworks, paving the way for Roman practices of cultural incorporation. Yet unlike Alexander's sprawling and short-lived empire, which disintegrated rapidly upon his death, Rome built lasting administrative structures. Initially, the Roman Republic was just one of many city-states in Italy engaged in modest localized trade and occasional conflicts, but over the centuries, Rome steadily expanded its territory, carefully integrated defeated populations through a structured hierarchy of citizenship and varying legal statuses, and this approach allowed conquered peoples to some level of autonomy that was nonetheless bound firmly to Rome through law, trade, and military obligations. So, indeed, the Roman legal system became one of its crowning achievements. Roman law, or civitas, provided a consistent framework for governance across diverse territories, making the administration of such a large and varied empire feasible. The Emperor Justinian's later codification of Roman law was particularly significant. By formalizing laws around property rights, citizenship, trade, and even slavery, Justinian ensured that Roman legal principles would endure far beyond Rome's own territorial limits. These codified laws were eventually adopted across Europe, profoundly influencing the legal traditions that survive in modern forms today. However, beneath Rome's veneer of order and integration lay significant tensions. Central to Rome's economy was an unprecedented dependence on slavery, arguably the most extensive and systematic slave-based economy the ancient world has ever seen. Slavery permeated every aspect of production, from agriculture and mining to artisanal and household labor. The empire's reliance on continuous military conquest to replenish its slave population also created vulnerabilities. As Rome's expansion reached its geographic limits, its slave-based economy became unsustainable, leading to economic stagnation and social strain. Additionally, Roman integration of diverse populations often proved superficial, confined largely to elites and merchant classes. While upper-class individuals across the empire enjoyed Roman citizenship and associated privileges, the vast majority remained excluded. These disparities contributed to increasing social unrest, rebellions, and internal fragmentation. Simultaneously, Rome's military structures had to change. Originally reliant on citizen soldiers deeply invested in the Republic's fate, Rome increasingly turned to mercenary forces, recruited from far beyond its borders, particularly from Germanic tribes. Ironically, Rome's own military and commercial expansion provided these peripheral people with Roman weapons, tactics, and crucially a desire for luxury goods, setting the stage for future incursions into Roman territory. Thus, by the 3rd and 4th centuries, the empire faced mounting external pressures combined with internal structural vulnerabilities. It was precisely during this moment of vulnerability and transformation that Rome undertook its most symbolic shift, the relocation of its administrative center from Rome to Byzantium, renamed Constantinople. Byzantium was strategically positioned on the Bosphorus Strait, was perfectly situated to control trade between Europe and Asia, and manage the increasingly crucial eastern Mediterranean provinces. These provinces, culturally rich and economically powerful, particularly Egypt and Syria, had become critical to Rome's survival. Yet this relocation was not just an administrative convenience. It marked a profound cultural and ideological shift. Constantinople, often described as the New Rome, signaled Rome's increasing integration with Greek and Near Eastern traditions. So the continuity and adaptation of the Mediterranean world continued on here, where Byzantium not only represented Rome's eastern outpost, but is ultimately the rightful heir to Greek civilization, synthesizing Roman administrative sophistication with Greek cultural and intellectual traditions. So Byzantium would continue on for another 1,000 years, long after Rome's western provinces fell into decline and fragmentation. And crucially, Byzantium preserved the Roman legal tradition, classical Greek culture, and early Christian theology, passing them down to medieval Europe and the Islamic world. And in particular, the code consolidated by Justinian. The German legal theorist Friedrich Karl von Savigny has noted that the legal codes that carried themselves through all the way into the Middle Ages and remains more or less the basis of many of our laws that we would consider European, was conducted at precisely this moment when the fear of decline was present, and yet it was already after the point at which society had already begun to change. So within this tension-filled context, this is where we need to understand Christianity's remarkable rise from being originally a fringe sect on the periphery of the empire to becoming the ideological basis of this new Rome. So Christianity emerged from these internal contradictions and social tensions, was initially a radical sect amongst Jewish prophetic traditions, but it carried an explosive ideological message: the spiritual equality of all humans, including slaves and marginalized people. Michael Mann argues in his work on social power that Christianity offered a symbolic resolution to the inherent tensions within the Roman Empire, theoretically uniting disparate peoples under a shared religious ideology. However, Mann also highlights the crucial discrepancy that, although the ideals were revolutionary, its actual unfolding was complex. His interpretation is actually more or less identical to what I would call the Gibbon thesis, which has been more or less the standard interpretation for about 400 years, based off of Gibbon's analysis in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So here they're suggesting that Christianity was straightforwardly emancipatory ideology, and that it was antithetical to Roman paganism and sort of positioned itself as the successor. Now, the issue with this is that whilst the radical message of equality for all, including the supposedly non-human slave and foreigner populations, in fact, the population that Christianity spreads most rapidly to appears to be literate, urban, middle-class merchants, bureaucrats, and intellectuals. So Mann and Gibbon are building off of hagiographies, which were saints' biographies that emphasized that sort of Christian versus pagan conflict, which was the core antagonism within the Bible and within theology, and they sort of projected that onto what happened historically. In fact, early Christian communities seem to have established themselves most rapidly in the cosmopolitan Mediterranean cities like Corinth, Thessalonica, Ephesus, and Philippi, each with bustling hubs of multicultural interactions. So here Christianity's appeal was less about the immediate social revolution and more about offering a spiritual and moral framework accessible to an increasingly diverse and literate Mediterranean urban elite. So Richard Monk, drawing upon and extending Max Weber's sociological analysis, provides a crucial insight into why Christianity might have resonated with this demographic. He suggests that Christianity fostered a form of universal individualism, emphasizing individual moral accountability before a universal God. So this appeals to urban professionals, merchants, and bureaucrats who were trying to navigate the increasingly impersonal commercial and administrative structures that were nonetheless certain citizens, Roman citizens, might be privileged, despite not necessarily being, by all accounts, the most important people in the room, so to speak. So for these groups, Christianity provided both ethical and guidance, existential reassurance that within this rapidly changing social and economic environment, the faith spread not necessarily just through these lower strata, but also these individuals positioned strategically within Rome's core middle society. So Faber had previously argued that religious movements like Christianity often facilitate the emergence of a new class consciousness and social identities. So Christianity, this was particularly relevant as it was institutionalized. So as Lewis Mumford emphasizes, the transformation of this ideology into a powerful institutional entity profoundly shaped subsequent Western trajectories. He emphasized how institutionalized Christianity, particularly through monasticism and cathedral building, preserved Roman law, educational structures, and literary traditions even after the collapse of the political authority. And whilst you might say the original teachings of Jesus might have emphasized equality, and then it became justification for this large institution of the Roman Empire, it's also very likely that we wouldn't hear or know anything about Christianity if it hadn't been institutionalized, because there were many similar sects that could have been taken up, but the particular affinity, or as Weber would call it, elective affinity between this middle-class strata of multi-ethnic, urban professionals, I'd say, and the position in a changing Europe was one of the reasons, and actually not just Europe, but also Persia, Middle East, North Africa, and so on. So Mumford's analysis of monasteries is also quite significant insofar as the concentration of religious work that was dedicated fully to the link between spirituality and practice was most substantially preserved and reproduced in these isolated communities of monasteries. Now, because of that link between work and structure, and work and self-value, these monasteries became what Mumford would describe as the earliest form of capitalism, of factories, of people working as a collective towards the production of a greater good. And this is one of the reasons why these monasteries and abbeys amassed such large wealth, particularly through things like brewing, agriculture, and so on. And one of the reasons why later nationalist religious movements such as Anglican Protestantism try to claim back this wealth from these highly productive monastic religious orders. So, nonetheless, these places are, sort of remain as these safe havens for the institutionalized church and the scholarship that would otherwise be lost certainly in the Western European context. But as we've seen, the emergence and institutionalization within the Roman Empire very much shaped subsequent Western civilization. But to appreciate the diversity of spiritual responses to imperial power, we really need to look beyond Rome and examine contrasting examples in other regions. So, two particularly instructive cases are Ethiopia's distinct form of Christianity and the traditional spirituality of the Ashanti Empire. So, Ethiopian Christianity stands as one of the earliest and most enduring examples of Christianity beyond Rome or Byzantine influence. By the early 4th century, around the same period, Emperor Constantine was officially endorsing Christianity in Rome. King Ezana of the Aksumite Empire in present-day Ethiopia converted to Christianity. However, Ethiopia's adoption of Christianity was not an imperial importation, unlike Rome, where Christianity was shaped by existing administrative and legal structures. Ethiopian Christianity developed independently, integrating with local customs, languages, and spiritual practices as they existed in East Africa. So this independence from the external authorities allowed Ethiopian Christianity to maintain a substantial autonomy, resilience, and a distinctive character. Deeply rooted in these local traditions, it incorporated many elements of indigenous African spirituality, including reverence for ancestors, symbolic rituals, and distinctively Ethiopian liturgies. Notably, the Ethiopian Church maintains its linguistic and scriptural autonomy, preserving the scriptures in Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language, rather than Latin or Greek. Such linguistic independence reinforced national identity, cultural pride, and spiritual authenticity separate from any external, and in particularly from any European authority. So over years, the unique religious identity proved to be a source of significant political strength and cultural cohesion for Ethiopia. Indeed, Ethiopia became one of the few African nations to actually resist sustained European colonial domination in the late 19th and early 20th century, successfully repelling Italian forces at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. This victory was not just a military feat, it represented a profound symbolic triumph. Ethiopian Christianity served as a spiritual foundation for national identity, bolstering collective resistance to European imperialism. The Ethiopian Emperor Menelik II explicitly invoked Ethiopia's ancient Christian identity as a rallying cry, framing resistance to Italy as a sacred duty to protect their Christian heritage from external oppression. Centuries later, Ethiopian Christianity's spiritual resilience and autonomy would inspire global movements, most notably Rastafarianism, which emerged in the Caribbean during the early 20th century. So Rastafarians viewed Ethiopia under Emperor Haile Selassie as a symbol of African independence, spiritual sovereignty, and anti-colonial resistance. Rastafarianism further universalized Ethiopian spiritual symbols, portraying Ethiopia not only as a historically independent, but also a spiritually authentic, a beacon for those resisting colonialism, racial oppression, and cultural erasure. Thus, Ethiopian Christianity's historical journey illustrates how spirituality, when locally rooted and independently maintained, can powerfully unify people and resist imperial domination, offering a compelling counter-narrative to Christianity's European associations with empire building. So, contrasting Ethiopia's Christian response, the Ashanti Empire in West Africa represents a different spiritual reaction to similar imperial forces, one anchored deeply in traditional indigenous practices. Located in present-day Ghana, the Ashanti Empire thrived from the late 17th to the 19th centuries, characterized by sophisticated governance, powerful military, and extensive trade networks. Crucially, the Ashanti spirituality integrated directly into political and social life, binding society together through collective rituals, ancestor reverence, and localized deities connected to community life. Unlike Christianity's universalizing tendencies, Ashanti spirituality emphasized localized beliefs tied to particular landscapes, peoples, and historical memories. And central to the Ashanti religious life was the concept of ancestral spirits, symbolized by the famous golden stool, a sacred object said to house the soul and the collective spirit of the Ashanti people. As long as the golden stool remained safe and revered, Ashanti's spiritual identity and cultural autonomy remained intact. Thus, the spiritual and political were deeply intertwined. Rituals and sacred symbols directly underpinned Ashanti governance, legitimacy, and resistance to external forces. So these tightly integrated spiritual political frameworks proved resilient when confronting European colonial powers, and particularly the British during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Unlike neighboring peoples who quickly adopted Christianity under colonial influence, the Ashanti fiercely resisted, mobilizing their traditional beliefs as symbols of resistance. When British colonial authorities tried to seize the Golden Stool in 1900, a profound violation of Ashanti spiritual autonomy, it ignited widespread rebellion and resistance known as the War of the Golden Stool, or the Ya Asantewa War. Though militarily defeated in the short term, the Ashanti spirituality maintained cultural autonomy and symbolic resistance, continuing to anchor the West African anti-colonial and later post-colonial movements. So, like Ethiopian Christianity, the Ashanti indigenous spirituality illustrates a different response to empire from the Roman or even the Ethiopian. While Christianity in Ethiopia adapted external religious forms to foster an autonomous identity, Ashanti spirituality offered inherent resistance precisely because it refused the universalism and emphasized the localized meanings embedded deeply within communities, landscapes, and ancestral memories. This provided a powerful cohesion against attempts at colonial cultural erasure. So these two cases, Ethiopian and Ashanti, highlight essential lessons about religion, culture, and empire. First, religion is not merely a passive force imposed by conquerors on conquered peoples. Rather, religious systems frequently serve as dynamic, adaptable cultural resources capable of resisting and reshaping external imperial pressures. Second, religious systems are highly context dependent, responding to specific historical, cultural, and political circumstances. Ethiopian Christianity succeeded because it maintained autonomy and integrated deeply with local identity, ensuring resilience against external domination. Ashanti spirituality succeeded differently, emphasizing localized traditions, ancestral memory, and cultural specificity rather than universal claims, providing powerful ideological resistance precisely through its embedded particularisms. Third, most examples highlight how religious systems form essential symbolic frameworks for collective memory and social cohesion. So, in our comparative framework, we can see that the limits of Christianity's universalizing claims, particularly when these become linked to hierarchical imperial power structures, as was the case in Rome, that might become a unifying ideological force within imperial contexts. It nonetheless struggled to maintain authenticity and local rootedness once it was institutionalized. By contrast, Ethiopian and Ashanti traditions, precisely because of their autonomy and the localized particularism of their belief systems, were capable of fostering genuine cultural resistance and were, in fact, in many ways more resilient to imperial domination. So examining Ethiopian and Ashanti responses enriches our understanding of how civilizations engage with religion as imperial tools, whether to consolidate empires or to resist and preserve cultural identity. By appreciating that there are these different spiritual trajectories, we can better understand civilization as a diverse, dynamic process of ideological, cultural, and political negotiation. So, some final thoughts. First, we can understand and observe that religion can be a force of resistance. As demonstrated by the Ethiopian Christianity and Ashanti tradition, they can be the bedrock for resisting external domination. Second, religion is a basis for syncretic integration. Within the Roman context, Christianity exemplified how religion frequently acted as a powerful integrating force, absorbing and transforming elements of existing civilizations into new hybrid cultural forms. Early Christianity, initially radical and countercultural, gradually absorbed Romans' legal traditions, Greek philosophy, and even many pagan rituals. This syncretic process, analyzed by sociologists like Weber and Munch, were essential for Christianity's enduring legacy. Through syncretism, Christianity was transformed by the empire, even as it transformed the imperial society, demonstrating that religious ideologies are very rarely static. Instead, they continually evolve, adapt, and reshape the societies that they encounter. And Christianity's lasting cultural imprint on European civilizations owes much to this dynamic capacity for integration and adaptation, particularly visible in institutions like monasteries, universities, and ecclesiastical states, which preserved the classical knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans even after the political collapse of Rome itself. This is pointing out that third observation, that monasteries continue to persist as safe havens of knowledge. And when the collapse of the Roman Empire threatened widespread loss of literacy, education, and cultural continuity, monasteries emerged as crucial repositories for knowledge and cultural transmission. Monastic communities meticulously preserved classical texts, fostered agriculture and technological innovation, and regenerated civilization through periods of fragmentation and chaos. Without this institutional safeguard, the intellectual achievements, particularly those codified in legal principles and philosophical texts, might have been lost, leading to a completely different trajectory of European civilization. So lastly, the most important legacy that we still have from both Christianity and the Roman worlds are within the legal institutionalization. By intertwining Roman imperial administration with Christian canon law, Christian institutions not only secured the survival of law, but also profoundly influenced the development of governance structures. Justinian's legal codification in Byzantium crystallized the prior Roman legal traditions, particularly those concerning property rights and citizenship, but embedded these within a lasting Christian ethical framework. Weber's analysis highlights how religion can institutionalize that ideological power by harnessing existing administrative and legal structures into these ethical practices, and in perfect normalization would not necessarily require the state to be involved on a day-to-day basis, and really only necessary at moments of trials and conflict. So these four reflections show how religion has this multifaceted role in shaping civilizations, and sets us up for next week, when we will move beyond the Christian and Western European context to explore Islam and some of the influences it had across a very different, similar but different geography. So Islam in particular was profoundly shaped also by empire, but different systems of trade and intercultural interactions, all of which need to be understood in a similar non-linear way as we've already begun to do. So we'll examine the Islamic civilization's extraordinary mobility, adaptability, and dynamism, particularly during the Abbasid Caliphate, where Islamic scholars preserved and expanded our classical Greek knowledge, laying foundations for later global and European intellectual awakenings. We'll also conclude that lecture by discussing the Crusades, and that being a point at which this new intercultural exchange begins to move into the medieval and eventually the early modern and modern periods.